Welcome to the deep dive, where we take a stack of your sources, the research, the data, the compelling personal stories, and extract the essential intelligence you need to be truly well informed.
Today, we are undertaking a really critical and frankly, a pretty uncomfortable deep dive into the state of American public education. The source material you shared is deeply influenced by the powerful documentary Waiting for Superman, which, it just perfectly juxtaposes the systemic failures of the education system with the dreams of real families.
That blending of content is exactly what makes this material so necessary, right? We aren't just looking at charts and graphs.
Not at all.
Our sources weave together these heartbreaking personal journeys. You follow students like Anthony in Washington, D.C., Bianca in Harlem, Emily in Silicon Valley.
Daisy in East Los Angeles and Francisco in the Bronx, all of them their children fighting desperately for access to a quality education.
And then it pairs that with the cold, hard data and the policy analysis that tries to explain why their fight has to be so desperate in the first place.
So our mission today is ambitious. We really need to unpack the uncomfortable truths. We're aiming to identify the often invisible forces, the bureaucratic hurdles that have successfully just choked off meaningful reform for decades.
And crucially, we have to spotlight the solutions that actually work, the super schools and policy changes that offer not just hope, but a documented path forward for millions of kids who are currently trapped.
Tracked in failing systems, yeah.
And the stakes, as you noted, they just couldn't be higher. We often talk about education in terms of like funding or politics, but this is fundamentally about social mobility. It's about the core promise of the American dream.
If education is truly designed to be the greatest engine for equality it is, well, it's currently running on fumes. And that's deeply impacting the serious stratification between the haves and have-nots.
Exactly. Which brings us to this paradox.
A staggering paradox, really. We've known the system has been broken for generations, yet despite waves of national reforms, including, these monumental federal efforts and spending hundreds of billions of dollars, the problems identified decades ago have. They've either stabilized at a totally unacceptable level or, by many key metrics, have gotten worse.
So we have to ask the big question. Why is the most obvious solution to inequality proving so utterly resistant to change? Okay, let's start with some history, because the system has been sounding alarms for, over 50 years now. And we've consistently hit the snooze button. It really begins in 1966 with the monumental Coleman report.
Officially, it was called Equality of Educational Opportunity.
Right.
And that report was revolutionary, really. It was mandated by the Civil Rights Act, and it was meant to assess racial and socioeconomic equity in U.S. schools. What James Coleman and his team found was sobering, to say the least.
So what did they find?
They found that the U.S. was essentially running two separate and radically unequal educational systems, and the profound negative consequences were concentrated almost entirely on low-income minority students.
And the finding that really shocked people back then was that the differences in school funding and the quality of the buildings, they mattered less than the socioeconomic backgrounds and the peer groups of the students themselves.
Right, a finding that unfortunately contributed later to this kind of family is destiny cynicism, which we are absolutely going to challenge later in this deep dive.
But the main takeaway was unmistakable. Inequality of opportunity was just rampant.
And the warnings only got louder. Almost 2 decades later, in 1983, the National Commission on Excellence in Education released A Nation at Risk. And this wasn't some, dry government document. This was a screaming headline.
It certainly didn't mince words. They warned of a rising tide of mediocrity. A tide so severe that the commission grimly suggested, and I'm quoting here, if an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war.
An act of war. Just think about that language. It was designed to shock the country into action.
Yet here we are, decades later. We've seen these major national efforts like No Child Left Behind or NCLB, which was rolled out with this incredibly ambitious goal of getting 100% of children proficient in math and reading by 2014.
A goal we now know was, completely missed. The foundational aggregate problems identified in those 1966 and 1983 reports, they just persist.
And when you dig into the raw data in your sources, the stagnation and in some areas the outright decline, it's just absolutely damning. Let's start with where we stand internationally.
Yeah, on the global stage, using metrics like the PISA test, the sources confirm that among 30 developed countries, the U.S. lags significantly. We're ranking 25th in math and 21st in science.
So we're much closer to the middle or even the bottom of the developed world, not the leader we think we are.
Exactly. But I think the truly alarming insight from the data, the fact that just dispels the myth that we're only failing our poor students, is what happens when you narrow the comparison.
You're talking about looking at just the top performers.
The top 5% of students, the best of the best. When you compare our top 5% to the top 5% in other developed nations, the United States ranks dead last.
Last. That's staggering.
It is. This isn't about inner-city resources or poverty. This suggests a systemic failure to adequately challenge and cultivate even our most gifted students.
So what's causing that failure at the top? Is it a lack of rigor in the curriculum?
Primarily, yes. It points directly to a lack of a challenging curriculum in the upper tracks. And sort of paradoxically, a reluctance to push highly proficient students forward because the whole system is just inert.
So you're saying when you focus all the resources and attention on trying to boost the bottom performers, you actually risk starving the top.
You do. And the result is that our best students end up getting what amounts to a mediocre education by international standards.
And looking internally, the failure of NCLB's goals is just so clear. We mentioned that 100% proficiency goal for 2014.
Right.
Years after that target date, most states are still seeing proficiency rates hovering miserably around, 20 or 30% in core subjects.
That's right, which means the vast majority of public school students are not meeting grade level expectations.
And these proficiency failures are then compounded by this horrific disparity in graduation rates. It's a vivid demonstration of that stratification that Coleman warned us about way back in '66.
The numbers are just awful. African American students graduate high school at a rate of only 51%.
51%. Half.
And for Latinos, it's 55%. This falls so dramatically behind their white counterparts who graduated 76%.
And the sources even point out that 76% is itself, still lower than optimal, but that gap is the real tragedy.
And that failure translates directly into an economic disaster. It's measured not just in, current deficits, but in the massive compounding cost of lost potential.
Let's quantify it. The lifetime earnings gap.
Okay, so on average, a college graduate earns 73% more than the average high school graduate. Just that differential alone is a monumental drag on the economy.
And the Alliance for Excellent Education provided this terrifying estimate on just one group of students. They looked at the roughly 1.2 million students who should have graduated with the class of 2008 but didn't.
And the estimated cost to the nation from that single class of dropouts was nearly $319 billion in lost income over their lifetimes.
$319 billion from one class.
And that figure only captures lost wages. It doesn't even touch the lost tax revenue, the increased reliance on social services, or the higher public safety costs that are associated with low educational attainment. When you zoom out, the failure to educate one child becomes exponentially more expensive over their lifetime.
It's often said that, we pay for education or we pay for prison, and the sources use this really grim but necessary analogy from Pennsylvania to make the point.
The comparison is stark. In Pennsylvania, they spend approximately $33,000 a year per prisoner.
Okay.
Now, you contrast that with the average annual private school tuition, which the sources peg at about $8,300 a year.
So it's about a quarter of the cost.
Right. And if you track the total cost of an average prison term, $132,000, that same amount of money could have funded a prisoner's entire K-12 private education with $24,000 still left over for college.
That is just an insane misallocation of resources.
It is.
And that cost is measured in dollars, but the human toll is undeniable. Beyond the financial viability of a person's life, the data shows high school dropouts face dramatically worse health outcomes.
I mean, it's incredible. High school graduates live, on average, up to 7 years longer than dropouts. This crisis literally affects your lifespan.
And this failure to produce educated citizens slams directly into the needs of our modern economy, creating what everyone calls the skills gap.
Exactly. 50 years ago, the U.S. job market was structured differently. Only about 40% of high school graduates were expected to need college-level skills, so we could absorb a significant number of lower-skilled workers.
But the globalized, technology-driven economy has just fundamentally shifted. The sources predict that by 2020, which is already behind us now, making this even more urgent, 123 million American jobs will be in high-skill, high-pay occupations.
fields demanding advanced degrees in critical thinking, like computer programming, bioengineering, complex data analysis.
Yet the most chilling projection is that we will only have 50 million Americans qualified to fill those 123 million positions.
That deficit, a 73 million person gap, is an existential threat to America's global economic competitiveness. We are literally producing jobs that our own citizens cannot fill.
And globally, our ability to compete is just rapidly diminishing. In 1970, the U.S. produced nearly 30% of the world's college graduates.
And today, that number has been cut in half. We produce only 15%. Other nations are rapidly catching up and in many cases surpassing us in the fundamental resource of an educated workforce.
So the takeaway from all this data is that the warnings have been consistent, the numbers are damning, and the financial and human costs are just escalating. And yet we seem to be trapped in this endless cycle of failure. So, okay, we've established the crisis. The logical question is why? Why has reform failed so spectacularly? Most people, when they see a public failure, their first instinct is to point to a lack of money.
Right, just fund the schools more.
Exactly. But your source material systematically dismantles that common perception.
That perception is the first major hurdle we have to clear. The data on resources is just. It's deeply counterintuitive. Since 1971, real spending per student, adjusted for inflation, has more than doubled. It's gone from approximately $4,300 to over $9,000 per student annually. Yet, over that exact same period, national reading and math scores have remained stubbornly, completely flat.
So the correlation between more input, more money, and stagnant output, the scores, suggests we've been spending money in all the wrong places.
Or applying outdated solutions to modern problems. Let's dig into some specific input policies that were hugely popular but, as it turns out, demonstrably ineffective.
Let's start with class size reduction.
CSR. Makes perfect logical sense, right? Fewer students per teacher must mean more individualized attention and better results. So between 1960 and 2007, the national pupil-teacher ratio dropped by an astonishing 40%.
And this was often politically driven. I remember the highly popular 1997 California policy that mandated small class sizes across the whole state. But what did the data actually show?
The results were, at best, inconclusive in aggregate, and in many ways actively damaging. The problem is simple. If you have a rapid, mandated reduction of class size, you have to immediately hire tens of thousands of new certified teachers.
And when you dramatically increase demand overnight,
You have to dramatically lower the quality threshold of who you hire.
so the system basically traded smaller classes taught by average or even below average teachers for slightly larger classes that might have been taught by higher quality teachers. The quality of instruction just got diluted.
Precisely. You've replaced quantity with insufficient quality.
Yeah.
The evidence is now pretty consistent. Simply spending money to lower class size does not systematically improve student outcomes. Not unless the students are in the earliest grades and the class size reduction is incredibly radical, which is rare and extremely costly.
And a similar failure surrounds this idea of credentialism. We've seen a massive push for higher teacher qualifications, right? The prevalence of teachers holding a master's degree has more than doubled.
And yet, the research indicates that getting a master's degree, in and of itself, often does not correlate strongly with actual student achievement gains. These advanced degrees usually focus on pedagogy or specialized theory, not necessarily on content mastery.
And on top of that, these added certification hurdles, they can actually reduce the available supply of potentially great teachers.
For sure. You might have a brilliant mathematician or a scientist who would be an amazing teacher, but they're put off by the unnecessary bureaucratic requirement of getting a master's degree in education.
It really sounds like the system is optimized for compliance and job security, not for performance. Which brings us back to the core policy finding, the one that really matters more than anything else.
Teacher quality. It is the single most important factor in student achievement. This is the non-negotiable truth.
Research consistently shows that the impact of a great teacher is greater than class size, it's greater than the curriculum you choose, it's even greater than the socioeconomic background of the student body.
It all comes down to the person standing at the front of the room.
So let's detail the devastating variance in effectiveness. The source material highlights this huge performance gap between the best teachers and the worst.
The difference is truly radical. On average, a teacher in the bottom quintile of effectiveness. So the bottom 20% covers only about 50% of the required curriculum in a school year.
50%.
They're slow, they're inefficient, and they often lack the classroom management skills to maximize their time.
And the top performers, what do they do?
A teacher in the top quintile often covers 150% of the curriculum. They move faster, they challenge students more deeply, and they make the learning actually stick.
And the cumulative impact of that difference is,
It's profound. Look at the Dallas data presented in the sources. Students who had 3 consecutive years of effective teachers improved their math scores by an impressive 21 points.
and the inverse, for kids who are unlucky enough to get ineffective teachers.
Those who had 3 consecutive years of ineffective teachers didn't just tread water, they fell 30 points behind their peers.
Wow. So over 3 critical middle school years, the difference between having great teachers versus poor teachers is a staggering 51-point swing.
That's the difference between being ready for college and being functionally illiterate.
And this research directly confronts the most cynical argument in education, the one that says family is destiny, that poverty is just too strong a factor to overcome.
That argument is fundamentally refuted by the data on teacher impact. The estimates strongly suggest that having 3 to 4 years of high-quality teachers, we're talking teachers in the 85th percentile of effectiveness, can generally overcome the average achievement deficit between low-income kids and their more advantaged peers.
So great teaching is the equalizer.
It is the equalizer. It can break the cycle of poverty.
But the reality of getting those great teachers in every classroom means we have to confront the uncomfortable truths about systemic accountability. And that often means addressing teachers' unions and the bureaucratic hurdles that protect ineffective performers.
The sources outline a system that aggressively protects seniority and process over actual performance. One of the most notorious practices is the dance of the lemons.
The dance of the lemons.
It's a cynical process where principals, who are facing these lengthy and expensive firing procedures, simply transfer incompetent teachers to another school within the district. The problem just gets shuffled down the road, never solved.
And the administrative costs of this protection are just immense. I mean, look at the example of the rubber rooms in New York State.
It's unbelievable. These were rooms where teachers who were suspended for misconduct or incompetence would wait, often for years, for lengthy disciplinary hearings.
And the source material is clear. These hearings last, on average, 8 times longer than the average U.S. criminal case.
While waiting, these teachers remain on full salary, costing the city an estimated $65 million annually. That is money being spent to warehouse non-performing adults instead of educating children.
It highlights the tremendous difficulty in maintaining high professional standards when the accountability mechanisms are just so weak.
And in Illinois, the sources note that only 1 in 2,500 teachers loses their credentials. Compare that to 1 in 57 doctors or 1 in 97 attorneys who lose their licenses.
It's hard to argue that teaching is a rigorous profession when the bar for dismissal is that low.
And this leads us to the heart of the policy failure. As the source material summarizes, nobody's job or career is heavily dependent on student performance.
If we agree that teacher quality is the decisive factor,
Then the incentive structure that allows for this protection has to be replaced with one that is based on performance.
I have to pause here, though, and push back a little on the premise that aggressively removing poor teachers is easy.
Hmm.
Union advocates counter these points, right? They argue that the system isn't as static as it appears.
What's their argument?
They note that the high rates of voluntary teacher turnover, up to 40 or 50% of teachers leaving within 5 or 6 years, especially in high-poverty schools, acts as a kind of voluntary self-policing mechanism for people who aren't a good fit.
And that's a fair point. It does address the issue of self-selection. But that doesn't solve the problem of the tenured, low-performing teacher who stays for 30 years. The question isn't whether some bad teachers leave. It's whether we have mechanisms to ensure that no bad teachers remain.
So if the system is going to change, the focus has to shift to rewarding performance, not seniority or how many degrees you have. But how do you accurately measure that performance?
The proposed solution is to focus on something called value-added measurement, or VAM. This is really crucial for you to understand. VAM is an aggressive system of performance measurement that's designed to calculate the value a teacher adds to a student's learning over a given year.
And how does that work differently from just looking at raw test scores?
Simple test scores are flawed because they heavily reflect a student's socioeconomic background, their parents' education level, their prior achievement. VAM tries to isolate the teacher's effect by statistically controlling for all those external factors.
So it's measuring expected growth versus actual growth.
Exactly. If a student's predicted to achieve a score of 70 based on their background, but they achieve an 85 under teacher X, that teacher is assigned a high value added score. It directly separates the teacher's skill from the student's circumstances.
Which makes VAM a non-negotiable component of any fair, performance-based accountability system. It lets you identify the truly effective teachers who succeed against all odds.
And once we identify them, we have to incentivize them heavily and hold the others accountable. And this brings us to the truly astonishing policy finding embedded in the source material.
Tell us what that finding is.
The research suggests that if we could successfully eliminate just the bottom 5 to 10% of ineffective teachers in the country, and again, we're only talking about maybe 2 or 3 teachers in a typical 30-person school staff, and replace them with just average teachers. This one single action would be enough to push the United States near the top of international rankings in both math and science performance.
That is a phenomenal implication. It means the problem isn't this universally distributed mediocrity, it's highly concentrated. But the system is designed to protect those few ineffective performers at the expense of millions of kids.
Exactly. The best educational systems in the world, like in Finland, they are elite in who they select, and they're rigorous in who they retain. They do not allow ineffective teachers to remain in the classroom for very long. This is about establishing a high baseline of quality for the entire profession.
But let's play devil's advocate one more time on the political reality of this. Eliminating that bottom 5 to 10% sounds like a politically impossible, maybe even draconian solution that would invite massive pushback from unions and create a morale crisis. How does the source material address that huge challenge of implementation?
The sources suggest that the challenge lies not just in firing, but in defining a clear path to performance. The conversation needs to shift from being purely punitive to being about professional improvement. But ultimately, if a teacher, after significant professional development and mentoring, still consistently generates low value-added scores,
Meaning children are demonstrably falling behind under their instruction.
right, then the moral obligation shifts entirely to the child. The pain of removing one adult from their job must be weighed against the lifelong damage that's inflicted on 30 new children every single year.
That reframes the debate entirely. It forces us to ask, which pain is greater? The pain of changing the system or the pain of letting it stagnate? The frustration born from these systemic failures is exactly why the families profiled, Anthony, Bianca, Daisy, and Francisco, are so desperately seeking out those islands of excellence, the super schools like KPP and the Harlem Children's Zone. So let's look at what works.
When you really distill the success of these high-performing charter models, you find 2 overarching non-negotiable principles: pragmatism and high expectations.
Okay, what do you mean by pragmatism?
Pragmatism means ideology isn't allowed to get in the way of meeting children's needs. If a method doesn't work, they drop it and they try something else, quickly. No ego, just results.
And the high expectations are symbolized by these mottos like no excuses, which is key PPs or whatever it takes, from the Harlem Children's Zone.
It's an aggressive, unwavering belief that every single student can and will succeed, regardless of their background or the challenges they face at home.
The story of Susan Schaeffler, the founder of Key PPDC, perfectly illustrates this. She started her first class of 85 fifth graders in 2001 and immediately labeled them the class of 2009.
And that year, 2009, that wasn't their high school graduation day, was it?
No, 2009 was the year they were all expected to matriculate into college. She declared their destination the moment they walked into her classroom as 11-year-olds.
And that expectation changes everything: the curriculum, the pacing, the level of commitment required from the student and from the family. And the results proved the model. Over 80% of that first class did, in fact, go on to college.
This success isn't random. When the source material compares the Key PP model to the historic, almost mythical success of Jaime Escalante's 1980s math program at Garfield High in East LA, the story that inspired the film Stand and Deliver, you see 4 distinct, repeatable pillars of success emerge.
Okay, pillar 1, high expectations for all students. Escalante famously refused to track students, especially inner-city students, into remedial or low-level classes based on what somebody perceived their ability to be.
This is so important when we think about the personal stories. We see this fear reflected in Emily, the girl in Silicon Valley, who, despite having an ambitious family, was worried she'd be permanently tracked into remedial math and miss her chance to take the challenging classes needed for a top college.
And that fear is totally rational. Traditional tracking systems are often used to put low-income or minority students onto a permanent low expectations path. Successful schools like Summit Prep, which Emily applied to, succeed precisely because they operate with an aggressive no-tracking policy. They insist that every student is capable of handling a rigorous college preparatory curriculum.
Okay, what's pillar two?
Extended learning time. This is non-negotiable because disadvantaged students often start several grade levels behind. You simply can't catch them up in the traditional 180-day, 6-hour school year. It's not enough time.
So what did KPP do?
KPP schools radically increased the typical school day from 6 hours to at least 9 hours, often running from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. But they didn't stop there. They required Saturday classes every other week and a mandatory 3-week summer session.
So all told, that extended calendar provides up to 50% more learning time.
Which is the necessary input to get the desired output.
Pillar three, strategic use of standardized tests. And this isn't the shallow practice of teaching to the test that gives standardized exams a bad name.
Not at all. Escalante used difficult, high-stakes exams, like the Advanced Placement Calculus test, as a focus for team effort.
He brilliantly shifted the dynamic. Instead of the students battling the teacher, the entire class, he called them the calculus team, was battling the exam, an external, highly respected adversary.
This created a sense of shared mission, and it cultivated ganas, a Spanish word meaning desire, will, or hunger, which he believed was the key ingredient for success in students who had been told their whole lives they were incapable.
That external standard gave all the hard work meaning. Escalante basically told the parents, look, I'm sorry about the low grade, but I'm preparing them for a 3-hour exam that I didn't write and I won't grade. The standard is objective. It puts the focus entirely on achieving that high external benchmark.
And that brings us to pillar 4, great leadership and the power to lead. This is arguably the most critical pillar for actually replicating this success. A successful school in a high-poverty area needs a super principal.
And these leaders, they have to be effective teachers themselves, right?
Yeah.
Capable of building a strong culture, and they have to be given the autonomy to run their schools without bureaucratic interference.
And the most critical component of that autonomy is the power to manage their own staff. The principal has to have the power to hire and fire staff quickly, sometimes within 4 months, if they prove ineffective in the classroom.
Which is something standard district schools rarely, if ever, allow because of union contracts and district bureaucracy.
Exactly. It all comes back to the quality of instruction. Michelle Reed, during her controversial but high-impact tenure as D.C. Schools Chancellor, confirmed this foundational truth when she asked students what she could do to make their schools better.
And their response was unanimous and heartbreakingly simple.
Great teachers. They intuitively understood the difference between instruction that was engaging and challenging and effective and instruction that was just childcare.
The sources highlight this painful contrast between how America views teaching and how the rest of the world does. The director noted that in Japan, the role of sensei teacher carries this enormous societal stature, and teachers are often selected from the very top of their college classes.
In Finland, which is widely considered to have one of the world's best systems, teaching programs are highly coveted. Only 1 in 10 applicants is selected.
And this stands in stark contrast to the U.S., where, as the sources note, teachers generally come from the bottom 30% of their college class. Now, that's not to diminish the dedicated individuals who enter the profession.
Of course not. But it is a systemic problem when we're relying on our lowest achieving college students to solve our most complex societal problems.
Yet, Ree's success, even in the most challenging environments, proved that the children want a great education and will respond to high expectations. She pointed to Principal Dwan Jordan's success at Sousa Middle School.
Sousa had previously been flagged as a failing school. Under Jordan's leadership, their math proficiency more than doubled in just 1 year.
And Ree recounted that the students were so engaged and motivated by their progress that they were coming to school on Saturdays voluntarily to do extra work.
And that success absolutely shatters the stubborn, subtle bigotry, the darker voices, that allows us to believe that those kids can't learn. The kids themselves proved the lie of low expectations.
This brings us to the terrible central metaphor of this entire crisis, the lottery of opportunity. These islands of excellence exist, but getting access to them is a matter of pure, heartbreaking luck.
The filmmakers rightly noted that this rationing of quality public education is the opposite of what America stands for.
It's a total indictment. Education is supposed to be the public good, guaranteed by right, that levels the playing field. When you have to hold a desperate lottery to ration the single most critical factor for a child's future, it proves the standard system has failed.
Let's slow down and really look at the actual odds that were faced by the families we introduced earlier. These aren't just statistics. These are children's entire futures depending on the bounce of a lottery ball.
Look at Bianca in Harlem. Her family was seeking a spot in one of the successful charter schools there. She faced a brutal 5% chance of getting in.
5%, with 757 applicants vying for just 35 spots.
Daisy in East Los Angeles had a slightly better, but still desperate 7% chance for just 10 spots from 135 applicants.
And even Emily, in the relatively affluent area of Silicon Valley, was desperate for a spot at Summit Prep and still faced only a 24% chance for 110 places.
So 3 out of 4 highly motivated students who are doing everything right still get left behind.
And then there's the heartbreaking reality of Francisco in the Bronx, who applied to 7 different charter schools and was denied a place every single time. His final desperate hope was a school that required a 45-minute commute each way. It just shows the extremes families will go to for a shot at a decent education.
The lottery underscores the core problem. We know it works, but we utterly fail to replicate that success. And we should probably temper the charter school enthusiasm just a little with the finding from the Streethouse study from Stanford University that only about 17% of charter schools significantly outperform public schools.
That 17% figure is key. It means the majority of charters are just performing at or near the level of traditional public schools. But the success models, the KPPs, the Harlem Success Academies, they are desperate, rare diamonds. The urgency is in learning the formula from that 17% and figuring out how to scale it across every neighborhood.
The realization that islands of excellence will never be enough pushes the policy discussion beyond the schoolhouse walls and into the broader community. The child's environment just impacts their performance too heavily.
This is where the holistic approach of the Harlem Children's Zone, or HCZ, pioneered by Jeffrey Canada, becomes so critical. HCZ recognized that merely fixing the school isn't enough if the surrounding community remains dysfunctional.
So they provide comprehensive cradle-to-college services, addressing family stability, health, and community needs, not just academics.
And the sources offer a really compelling example of how external factors impact school performance. HCZ's asthma program. Harlem, a low-income area, had a neighborhood asthma rate of 30%, which is extremely high.
And asthma triggers chronic school absences.
Exactly. So by partnering with Harlem Hospital, HCZ helped families manage these triggers in the home environment. This significantly reduced emergency room visits, and critically, it drastically cut down the number of school days children missed.
A child can't learn if they aren't in the seat.
It just demonstrates that educational success often hinges on non-educational wraparound services.
The HCZ model proves that the comprehensive approach works. It lifts entire communities. But there's an immediate and daunting question of scale and funding.
HCZ operates with a massive $36 million annual budget. The staggering detail is that $24 million of that relies on private donations.
So 2/3 of the budget.
And that level of private philanthropy is just not replicable across thousands of high-poverty school districts across the U.S. Replication requires systemic change in how public funds are allocated.
However, there are models that achieve this kind of holistic support within a public setting. The John A. Johnson Elementary School in St. Paul, Minnesota, is cited as a successful community school model.
This is a really promising approach for scaling. At Johnson, where over 90% of students qualify for free or reduced price lunch, they house health services, dental care, family support, and housing assistance in a wing that's physically connected to the school building.
So it creates a seamless tapestry of support.
It eliminates the barrier of having to access essential services outside of school hours or requiring extra travel.
As we look for systemic solutions, we have to incorporate the view of organizations like the American Federation of Teachers, the AFT, which argues that solutions must be scalable in accessible neighborhood schools, and that teachers should be viewed as change agents, not scapegoats.
Their core policy demand is for shared responsibility and mutual accountability. They argue that accountability can't simply fall on the teacher. It has to be 360-degree, extending to principals, district administrators, and the policymakers who create the system that teachers operate within.
And union-led reforms have actually demonstrated their capacity to self-police and improve quality when they're given the autonomy to do it. A prime example is the Peer Assistance and Review Program, PAR, in Toledo, Ohio.
PAR is a union-instituted system. Instead of relying on ineffective principal evaluations, new teachers are intensively mentored and evaluated by consulting teachers. These are master teachers who are released from classroom duty to perform this role.
And based on these peer assessments, they make tough calls.
They do. In Toledo, 8 to 10% of new teachers are advised to resign or do not have their contracts renewed. This demonstrates that unions can, and sometimes do, enforce rigorous performance standards internally.
That's a crucial data point. It challenges the narrative that unions are solely focused on protection. It shows that when they're given ownership over the quality control process, they can be effective partners in raising the bar.
Furthermore, they're shifting compensation models to align with performance gains, moving away from that rigid structure based on years of service and degrees held. The contract in the Pittsburgh School District is highlighted as a positive example.
This contract offers new performance incentives that could grant teachers up to $8,000 in extra pay a year for substantial academic gains.
And the key structural difference is that these incentives are tied not just to individual performance, but to school-wide academic gains, explicitly encouraging team collaboration among the staff rather than internal competition. That is how you change the culture of an entire building.
As we synthesize these solutions, the consensus across the source material is clear. Waiting for a superhero, a Michelle Rhee, a Jeffrey Candida, or some massive federal mandate, it's just not enough. The change has to be driven by a mobilized citizenry.
This is the core thesis behind Eric Schwartz's work with an organization called Citizen Schools. He argues that education reform has to stop being a spectator sport. The problem lies partly in the constraints of the school day itself. Children spend only 20% of their waking hours in school.
So we have to figure out how to leverage the other 80%.
Exactly. Schwartz focuses on mobilizing a second shift of educators. These are volunteer citizen teachers, professionals, architects, chefs, engineers, chemists who provide engaging, relevant apprenticeships to middle school students outside of the core academic time.
The anecdote about Dave Mantis, a PhD chemist, is really inspiring. He volunteers teaching a course called It-IS Rocket Science to middle schoolers.
And they don't just read about concepts. They're launching rockets, they're video conferencing with NASA engineers, and they're presenting their design concepts to pharmaceutical CEOs.
These engaging real-world projects directly connect abstract concepts to future careers, and they prove the value of science and math. And Citizen Schools programs report strong results.
Double-digit gains in math, science, and English proficiency, and crucially, a 52% increase in high school graduation rates for students who participate in their rigorous apprenticeship programs.
The underlying strategy here is proven across the country in another field. The sources call it the youth soccer analogy.
Right. The U.S. became a competitive soccer nation not by massively funding certified PE teachers, but by relying on 900,000 volunteer coaches.
So if citizens can drive excellence in soccer and the arts, they can certainly drive excellence in science and math.
That's the exact logic President Obama used when he was supporting efforts like National Lab Day, which aimed to pair one scientist volunteer with every certified science teacher. By leveraging the expertise of the external community, we enrich the curriculum and we make learning relevant for students who are craving that connection.
And the call to action isn't abstract. The sources provide specific, actionable steps for every constituent, starting with the group that historically drove school success.
Parent involvement in the PTO, or PTA, has drastically dropped over the past 50 years, from 47% to a dismal 19%.
19%.
Parents are urged to rejoin these groups, to utilize online resources like School Matters, to research local school data like dropout and literacy rates, and to proactively advocate for their children to be enrolled in a rigorous college preparatory curriculum.
Students, too, must take ownership. They're encouraged to stop waiting and start developing a concrete research plan for their own graduation and college path. And using their natural skills, they should use platforms like videos and social media to highlight problems and advocate for specific policy changes at local and state levels.
And business leaders, who are constantly complaining about the lack of qualified workers, they must stop treating education as someone else's problem. They're urged to establish proactive partnerships, provide real internship opportunities, and convene roundtables to link high school curricula directly with desired workforce skills.
A powerful model for this is the Manchester Bidwell Corporation's program, which successfully created a pipeline for chemical laboratory technicians. It moved students directly from high school to high-paying, high-skilled jobs.
When the curriculum is clearly linked to a high-wage job, motivation just skyrockets.
This systemic engagement confirms the ultimate shift in mindset that's needed, something raised by the filmmakers. This crisis affects suburban schools, too. Emily's experience in Silicon Valley proves that mediocrity is often masked by the success of the top students who will succeed anywhere.
leaving the bottom 75% stuck in an inadequate system that is just good enough to keep them quiet.
And the breakthrough isn't just policy or money, it is a fundamental shift in belief.
The success of these superschools serves as the necessary proof point that shatters the most persistent, darker voice inside the public mind, the acceptance that those kids can't learn. Once that belief is shattered, the political will for change becomes unstoppable. Wow. So to synthesize what we've learned today, the ingredients for educational success are known. They require high-quality teaching, radical accountability driven by isolating teacher performance, extended learning time, and robust external community support.
And the profound tragedy remains that access to this success is currently left to the randomness of a lottery, rather than being guaranteed as a right for every single child in this country.
And the urgency is immediate. Our economic future, our ability to compete globally, and our founding promise of social equality all hinge on fixing this broken system now. We have to move past the finger-pointing and focus aggressively on replicating the demonstrable solutions that work, and scaling them into the lottery is completely obsolete.
The time for hand-wringing has long since passed.
It has.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. And this comes directly from the heart of the source material. The sources suggest that the biggest obstacle we face is not money or policy, but the indifference born of hopelessness, the acceptance of those darker voices that allow us to drive by failing schools and just assume the problem is too complex, too political, or too painful to fix. So here's the question. If we know, based on hard data, that eliminating just the bottom 5 to 10% of ineffective teachers could immediately make the U.S. globally competitive in math and science, what specific, immediate actions are you willing to take in your own community, whether it's through volunteering, joining the PTO, or policy advocacy, to support the painful but necessary changes needed to achieve that goal? The change doesn't depend on a miracle worker swooping in from above. The message of all this research is clear. There is no more waiting for Superman. There is only you and me.